What I do is I train police officers internationally, and my target country is Brazil. I run an outfit called U.S. Police Instructor Teams. What we do is we take police officers from here overseas to countries that need to learn about the American policing model. And my view, or the view that I bring to you, is the view of the Brazilian citizen. Not necessarily does it reflect my views, but it is the view that I get when I'm overseas. Just recently, just to give you a little bit more qualifications as to why I'm here talking to you, I received the highest decoration in the state of Rio de Janeiro, which is the Tiradentes Medal. It's akin to our Freedom Medal for all the work that I've done over the past 7 years there. So I'm well imbued in the Brazilian psyche and how they think and how they perceive the United States and the American citizen, which are two different things. First of all, I'd like to take a step back from the issue that we're discussing here and look at why is so much hatred being directed to the United States these days. And why if the United States has a benevolent government and a benevolent society that we want to and wish to aid and help other countries, why are we viewed in such a manner as the typical Brazilian places it in this, he uses this phrase, the American is arrogant and ignorant. And I asked them, why do you say that? Before the American was brash and cocky. And from brash and cocky, we've become arrogant and ignorant. And they refer back to us as children going to school, grade school. And they tend to point out just one specific item in our education, which is geography. They feel that the American nation, the American citizen as a whole, doesn't know geography that well. They can't place the major countries in the world and what these major countries represent. And because of this, they feel that as the American grows older, he tends to take that lack of knowledge, interest, and transposes the American values onto nations when they have contact with these nations. And this tends to irritate the Brazilian a little bit. He sees the American government as not being even-handed, and its policies are a mishmash of ethical qualms, many times dictated and directed by our national security interests. So when they see an uneven-handed policy being held across the board, it tends to confirm the fact that there is a certain amount of arrogance in the American government. Now, how does this translate to the United Nations? The UN is a reflection, a mirror, of the peoples of the world whose representatives are there to discuss the topics of interest amongst those nations. Now, when the UN, as a reflection, as a mirror of these people, stand up and say to the United States, you should not do this, you shouldn't go into Iraq, or you shouldn't take this position, and the United States does it unilaterally, then it tends to lead the Brazilian citizen to think that the United States really is an arrogant country. It has the power, and yet it doesn't use that power wisely. They consider the lack of even-handedness as a reflection of the American government. This is a difference between the American citizen, who is normally well-liked in many nations that I've been to. There's a difference that the foreign citizen makes, the Brazilian citizen makes. He distinguishes the American government as being an entity that does not reflect in its entirety the aspirations of the American citizen as an individual. The American citizen as an individual is well-liked. He's spontaneous, he's fun-loving, and he's benevolent, again, towards the people he meets. The government of the United States does not transpose those same values to the citizens around the world. And what we have then is, again, the lack of cohesiveness between the American individual that is met on the street and the American government, who, in the case of Brazil, for example, has detrimental effects when the Brazilian citizen comes into contact with the American government. Hundreds of people per day come into contact with the American government overseas. when the Brazilian citizen, for example, applies for a visa, they go into a consulate or an embassy overseas, and they're given a questionnaire, and they go through an interview, which is akin to a criminal going through a police interview here. They're asked questions of depth, they're asked questions that are intrusive, and many times they're refused visas, and they generate, through this interview, a lasting impression that the United States is mean, and that the interview process is intrusive, invasive, and it doesn't produce any benefit. Many times, before the person gets to the interview at the consulate or inside the embassy, they have to stand outside in line, and they're discussing the interview or the trip that they're about to take to the United States with those people that are in line. And many times they'll know that the person ahead of them, the person behind them, is trying to get a visa to come here as an illegal alien to work, generate income, and send back to their family. Many times that person that has that intention is given a visa where the person that just spoke with a fellow that has a family that wants to come to the United States, that comes to Disney with their children, many times is refused a visa. Or draconian policies like, we'll grant a visa to the wife but not the husband. We'll grant the visa to the two children but not the parent. So there's a tremendous amount of ill will being generated daily through our State Department. This is just one aspect of what goes on overseas. Through our State Department in terms of generating ill will to these people that come to the consulate trying to come here to visit and spend their monies. Now, this is something that affects the person on the street, and the person then translates this into what is the United States doing in relation to the United Nations. We've tried to relegate the UN to irrelevance, and that hasn't worked. As a matter of fact, by doing that, we've created a United Nations that in the near future will be ever more relevant to the world. And in yesterday's newspaper, the Orlando Sentinel, Mr. Bercia writes that in today's challenging world, which finds itself both increasingly, and I quote this, interdependently and twisted by multiplying tensions and troubles, the United Nations has more importance and necessity, indeed indispensability, than ever. If anything, the United Nations leadership, authority, and power warrant reinforcement. Such developments would not, by the way, threaten the sovereignty of the United Nations, for the United Nations bows to its member and not the other way around. The United Nations is there to help serve us and our needs, and not the other way around. So, in reference to the U.S. and its turning or trying to turn the UN as an irrelevant entity, did not go well overseas. Again, I was taken to task by citizens of that nation by saying that, again, this shows how arrogant the United States has become. You're the only superpower, and you're using the power poorly. You're going into places where you shouldn't have. The world requested that this should not be done, and yet you went ahead and did it, and the proof for the pudding is nowhere, because there are no weapons of mass destruction in the case of Iraq, or there is no bin Laden caught in the case of Afghanistan. These are topics that have been discussed here before, I'm not going to go into. But I think that we have to reinvent our image abroad. Before we get to discussing the UN as a stumbling block, it's become a stumbling block in our minds. It's not a stumbling block to the nations of the world. The nations of the world see the UN as a viable entity, a necessary one at that. We have to reinvent ourselves. If Madonna can do it, if Cher can do it, certainly we can draft the Madison Avenue types to reinvent the United States. I'm talking about an image problem, not a policy or content problem. Policies and content the United States has and will carry forth in the world are going to be the same. They're not going to change. We have our national interests, and we have the well-being of our nation to take care of, and the well-being of our citizens. But we do have to change the image we project. It can't be all McDonald's and Coca-Colas. It's got to be something of substance, something of equilibrium, and something that we can look overseas and say, well, we've acted, image-wise, we've acted well, and people are now seeing us in a better light, because as a community and as a citizen of the United States traveling overseas, I feel the hatred that I didn't feel 2 years or 3 or 4 years ago. So it is a problem, and it should be addressed. Again, I'm not here to change policies. I'm trying just to change the reality of what is seen by others on us. Thank you very much.
And what I want to talk about is the view of the United Nations and the U.S. relationship viewed from abroad, from Africa. And I do this on the basis of a particular research project that I've been working on for many years, where I've been studying one particular operation in Africa that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But much of what we hear today stresses the tensions that exist between the United States and the United Nations in terms of foreign policy. And there are many sources that we get ideas about this tension, which to a certain extent even exaggerates it. In the news, we hear about this constantly, especially over the last year. I mean, the crisis in Iraq just really highlights the fact that the U.S. and the U.N. don't always get along or agree on what the world should be doing. Politicians, from time to time, either genuinely or in seeking the stage, have criticized the U.N. Former Senator Jesse Helm was probably the most notable in this regard. But issues have long existed about the funding of the UN, where the U.S. is obligated to pay the largest share of the budget, but doesn't have a proportionate share of control of the organization. Critics have claimed that the U.S. sovereignty is infringed by the UN. Other critics have pointed out that there are contradictions in the UN, at least from the perspective of the U.S., between the spirit of what the UN stands for and what it does. In other words, just like American foreign policy, a critic might say, doesn't always accomplish what it's supposed to stand for in the ideal sense, the UN also falls short. And one example that was played up in the U.S. media was when the Libyan representative was appointed as the chair of the Commission on Human Rights. Again, U.S. critics said, well, given the human rights behavior of Libya, how can this country hold this chair? The public also gets involved in this. And we see every year, we saw last year especially, and I imagine that we're going to see this year again, a kind of reinvigorated and heightened get the U.S. out of the UN kind of bandwagon as UN Day approaches at the end of this month. Others claim, along with this idea that the U.S. doesn't belong in the UN, that the UN is actually involved in a conspiracy to overtake the government of the United States and the governments around the world and create a world capital in New York, establish a world government. Then academics play into this also. Various academics come from all different opinions, but some of them echo many of the charges leveled by the politicians, heard in the news, and voiced by the public. So we all know this and we've heard this. But the reality is that often this disjuncture between the foreign policy pursued by the United States and that desired by a majority of nations around the world as voted in the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, this disjuncture is real and it's important. But in the present environment, they've become exaggerated. It's easy to forget the many instances which the U.S. and the UN work together towards a common interest or common good consistent with the will of most nations of the world, or instances where the U.S. and the UN work together because the U.S. and its allies are able to successfully manipulate UN procedures so as to serve their interests. But whether it's out of an idea of a common good or whether it's out of an idea that the U.S. is able to use the UN as a tool, the instances of juncture as opposed to disjuncture remain many. One instance, and perhaps the most glaring instance of the U.S. being able to use the UN to further its desired policy was the very Korean War. Now, this was accomplished in the absence of the USSR, which wasn't able to exercise a veto over this, but again, U.S. policy was pursued. The Gulf War of 1991 is an example where the U.S. was able to marshal international sentiment around its foreign policy goals. And numerous peacekeeping interventions and other sorts of interventions in Latin America, the Balkans, and the Middle East have served to further and or protect U.S. interests. it seems that most people and most commentators, they tend to move to the extremes. Either the U.S. and the U.N. are at odds and inconsistent with each other and at war with each other, or they gloss them over, where in reality, the reality is much more complicated and somewhere in the middle. So now to highlight what I'm talking about, I want to talk about one case, one of which most of you probably know nothing or next to nothing. For the last 8 years, I've researched one particular peacekeeping mission in northern Africa, named MINURSO. This is the mission to bring about a referendum in Western Sahara. The acronym makes sense if you speak French. And it's been in place since 1991 to do two things. It's there to monitor and maintain a ceasefire in a civil war or a war of liberation, depending on whose perspective you take, between the Moroccan army and the revolutionary Polisario movement, which is seeking independence for the former colony of Spanish Sahara, or the territory presently known as Western Sahara. Along with maintaining a ceasefire in this war, it's there to organize and hold a referendum in this territory so the indigenous people, the Sahrawi people, can decide whether they want their political future to be one of integration into the Kingdom of Morocco or independence. The heart of this conflict lies in that Morocco claims the territory of Western Sahara as an integral part of a historic broad Morocco, while the Polisario, representing the Sahrawi people, argue that the Sahrawis are separate from the Moroccans, and they are a distinct people, and hence, and they were also a distinct colony. And hence, in the international regime of decolonization, they're entitled to self-determination within their borders. Now, this war that most people know nothing about has been going on for 30 years on paper. But although it's been going on for 30 years on paper, the UN has been involved since 1991. And since 1991, there has not been one significant violation of the ceasefire. So the UN's been very successful here. The UN came in and agreed to monitor the ceasefire because they also thought that a political solution was at hand. They entered Western Sahara with an agreement in place between the Moroccan government and the Polisario to hold this referendum that they're mandated to organize, and the two sides agreed to abide by the decision reached in this referendum. However, despite this agreement that was there on paper in 1991, over 12 years have passed, and the UN is no closer to holding this referendum or bringing it about today than it was when it first arrived. In fact, they may be further. Kofi Annan, in his most recent reports on MINURSO to the UN Security Council, has expressed doubt that this referendum can ever take place. This skepticism has been echoed by former U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, who's worked since the mid-90s as the personal envoy and chief negotiator of the Secretary General. And as a result, again, despite the technical agreement of both sides to the idea of the referendum, diplomats are now working on an alternative means of resolving the conflict. Forget the fact that both sides have agreed that there will be a referendum and these people should have the right to decide how they want to resolve this war. It appears that it ain't going to happen. The issue that's been the sticking point for over a decade is who is eligible to vote in this referendum. In other words, who is a Sahrawi? And what complicates this determination is the fact that we're talking about a nomadic, tribal Saharan people who traditionally were not sedentary or lived in any kind of urban environment. Therefore, records weren't kept. So the Moroccans have stressed for over 10 years that there are a large number of Sahrawis, and this is who we believe that they are. And if the Moroccan position is accepted, then they're going to win the referendum. On the other hand, the Sahrawis say we're a distinct bunch of people. Even though there are no records, we know who we are. We're not as many people as the Moroccans are saying we are. And if their list is accepted, which, by the way, the UN did promulgate a list around the year 2000, which matches the Sahrawi list, but if their list was accepted and became the basis of a referendum, the Sahrawis would win. So while the two sides can't agree, the referendum doesn't happen. But in the meantime, Morocco has continually demanded sovereignty over the territory, has administered it since 1976, when the colonial power Spain withdrew, and basically, because the war just keeps going on and on and on and is not moving towards a referendum, it's being rewarded for its intransigence over the last decade. So the questions are, how can this happen, and what does this have to do with the theme of this symposium? And the answer lies in the interest of the United States, and in this case, as weird as it is in the present environment to think that these two countries have similar foreign policies, France. The explanation for this continued state of affairs rests with the relationship that the two combatant sides, the Moroccans and the Polisario, have with the great powers of the UN Security Council, especially the two that care about this conflict, which are the United States and France. And unlike the situation in Iraq, with which we are all familiar, here, U.S. and French policy and interests coincide, and both countries maintain important and strong relations with Morocco. For the United States, the geostrategic importance of Morocco dates back to the Cold War. Morocco lies on the southern half of the Straits of Gibraltar that allows for entry into the Mediterranean Sea in general. It's important to the United States that friendly countries maintain or control both sides of the strait. In addition, U.S. policy favors Morocco because Morocco has been a moderate and Western-leaning Arab state basically forever. It's seen as a bastion against Islamic radicalism. Throughout the Cold War, it was generally pro-West, and it served as a traditional voice of moderation in the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So Morocco is an important country to the United States. And on top of this, if you interview Moroccans, the first thing that any Moroccan will tell you, and I don't think this is a big part of the relationship, but they'll tell you this as if it is that the Kingdom of Morocco was the first country to sign a treaty of friendship with the United States at the time of the American Revolution. In fact, if you go through all the treaties, this is the first bilateral treaty of friendship that was signed. They put a lot more importance on that than I think the United States does. For France, Morocco is also important. It's a former colony, and the French have a strong sense of post-colonial patron responsibility to its former colonies. The French have important economic interests in Morocco. Probably most importantly, instability throughout North Africa, but particularly in Morocco, causes an increase in illegal immigration of Moroccans to Europe, and particularly France. And there's a huge Moroccan population already living in France. So the United States and France have close ties to Morocco, and they've used this to drive policy in the Security Council. On the other hand, the revolutionary movement, the Polisario, during the Cold War was characterized as a Marxist-influenced, pro-Soviet, revolutionary national liberation group, inherently anti-Western. Although with the demise of the Cold War, it's become apparent that there was never really any significant, if any, support at all given to this group by the Soviet Union. But thirdly, the principal patron of the Polisario has been Algeria. And Algeria also has a history of anti-Western behavior, a history of being pro-revolutionary, a history of being pro-Soviet. And with the end of the Cold War, its negative characterization has kind of moved from being pro-Soviet to being a bastion of fundamentalist threat to the rest of the world. So because the interests of the United States are so stacked, and the United States has a veto, as does France in the Security Council, both countries have worked to ensure that no resolution to this conflict inconsistent with Moroccan interests comes about. And this means that unless Morocco knows that it's going to win the referendum before it happens, the referendum ain't going to happen. Now, on the ground, both sides recognize the influence that the United States and France has had in driving this conflict towards resolution or in maintaining the status quo. Morocco, whenever the resolution to authorize MINURSO comes up for renewal, it appeals to its allies in the Security Council, France and the United States, to block any resolution that might force it to hold a referendum it might lose. So Morocco plays the card, saying, you, United States and France, you're our good friend, you don't want us, you don't want instability here, you don't want the Islamic radicals to get a foothold here, so you need to support us on this policy. The Polisario, on the other hand, also recognizes what's going on, and they're becoming increasingly frustrated with a UN led by countries that it knows favors Morocco. So it doesn't view this tension, it doesn't see this tension that we always hear about as existing between the United States and the United Nations. It largely views the United Nations and the United States as the same. Now, both sides, the Moroccans and the Polisario, maintain good working relations with the UN workers on the ground in Western Sahara, but they recognize that decisions are made and policy is driven from New York, not from the local area. So as a result, the UN to the Moroccans is a tool that they can use because they have the favor of the United States and France, and to the Polisario, it's largely illegitimate right now. Another example that I just want to briefly touch upon, which doesn't come from Africa but works the same way, is the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Everyone there sees the UN as a tool of great power interests, either U.S. interests or the interests of other powers. And every party to the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict to some extent views the UN as biased against it. Various Arab countries see the U.S. veto as giving an automatic voice to Israeli policy and Israeli desires. On the other hand, the Israelis don't accept that, and they think that the UN is biased against it. It sees a plurality of nations in the General Assembly inclined to vote against it, and it looks at the history of a resolution in the 1970s that equated Zionism with racism, and it looks at the pro-Arab bias of, or what it perceives as pro-Arab bias of European powers now. So from studying these cases, MINURSO and the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and understanding how the U.S. and other countries can use the UN to further their particular policy interests, even in this day, new questions arise. And I would submit that despite all the press that the disjuncture between the United States and the UN has gotten over the Iraqi incident, despite all the press that it's gotten, it's maybe not the disjuncture between the U.S. and UN policies that's most interesting, because they're pretty rare, and because the U.S. does still ultimately hold the veto power and the power of the purse. I would submit that what's more interesting is what happens when the U.S. is able to garner the support of its important and influential allies, such as the United Kingdom and France, in the UN and in the Security Council where real decisions are made, so that U.S. policy interests are promoted, but are at odds with those of the rest of the world. So in other words, what I'm saying is not this infighting in the Security Council, which is actually in the aftermath of the Cold War pretty rare, but the differences that happen in the General Assembly, when the great powers are united and can use the organization as a tool of their policy, yet this policy works against the interests of, or is perceived to work against the interests of the great majority of countries of the world. And this is nothing new. There's a big literature on this. It's called The First World versus the Third World, the North-South divide. But these, to me, are the really interesting cases. And what makes this interesting is that these types of cases, these types of conflicts, these kinds of issues may become more pronounced and sharp as the post-industrial world continues to globalize and integrate to the benefit of these countries, while the lesser developed world falls further and further behind, either unable to compete economically and or as they continue to be exploited by the developed post-industrial bloc. And I'll be happy to take questions and discuss this further with you at the end of the panel. Thank you.
It's a particular honor for me to be here at the Lou Frey Institute. I was a constituent of Congressman Frey many years ago when I was about the age of most of you in the audience and when the world seemed to be a lot simpler. It was bilateral. We knew who the enemy was. And today, 30 years on or thereabouts, we have a much more complicated picture. I want to try to paint just a small part of this by giving you some sense of what Russian views on the UN are. Essentially, Russia, and going back to the Soviet era decades in Soviet history, Russia has been a fervent champion of the UN. They've always spoken about the United Nations as playing a central role in the international order. There have been, from time to time, criticisms of this or that action or statement by the UN, but there's not been serious criticism of the United Nations as an institution. And this, of course, differs greatly from what one has seen in the United States over the last 20 years. Really, I think since 1983 to 1985. Of course, we had earlier instances of private organizations criticizing the United Nations. We had examples of people living in New York criticizing UN employees, who were the worst scofflaws of them all, parking where they wanted and ignoring tickets and this and that. But it was really only, it seems to me, in the 1980s that it became the policy of the U.S. government, at least at times, to begin to question the role of the United Nations in the international order. Now, not surprisingly, because Russians have not been exposed to an anti-UN lobby, they have generally favorable views of the organization. And let me give you some data here on surveys of what Russians think about the UN. In a survey of 1,500 Russians done in April of this year, 55% had a positive view of the United Nations, while only 17% had a negative view. Ordinary Russians are also more likely than we are to believe that the United Nations plays a significant role and an important and positive role in world affairs. 54% see the UN as exerting significant influence on international developments, while only 22% see its influence as insignificant. These are the views of ordinary Russians. When one polls the Russian elites, you get a slightly different view, and I think a better informed view, a more sober view, and a more accurate view. A survey of Russian politicians in the same period and those who shape public opinion showed that they were less sanguine about the United Nations' ability to influence international affairs. By a 2-to-1 margin, they said that its influence in recent years had been insignificant. But these same people were even more likely than ordinary Russians to see the UN as a positive force in world affairs, 80% versus only 4% of Russian elites who felt that it had a negative role in the world. I think probably it would be a somewhat different outcome if we looked at the U.S. So why is the UN popular with Russians, whether the mass of Russian people or the Russian leadership? Put simply, it's because Russia can no longer counter U.S. influence in international affairs on its own, as it could when Congressman Frey was in office, when it had the role of a superpower. It, at that time, too, like the United States, sought to use the United Nations for its purposes. But now they see the UN in the post-communist era as one potent weapon in their arsenal with which they can fight U.S. unilateralism. There is, and this will follow up some of the comments made by Mr. Saba earlier on, there is quite a negative view about the United States in Russia today, and of course in other parts of the world. Some data that I generated with a colleague of mine from Moscow. We did a survey of Russian civil servants over the last 2 years. These are ordinary, well, how should I say, ordinary Russian officials from lower class, lower grade civil servants working in local government, regional government, federal government, right up to the higher grades of civil servants. When you ask them about U.S. actions in their part of the world, which meant Afghanistan, and in Georgia, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and in Uzbekistan, here's what they said. 17.5% supported U.S. military action in Afghanistan. 17.5%. Even though the Russian government fully backed the United States in the wake of 9/11. 12% supported having U.S. military advisors in Georgia, a country on the southern border of Russia that also borders Chechnya, the breakaway republic, which has witnessed a horrible civil war over the last 10 years. 12.5% trust Americans of Russian civil servants. 1/8 trust Americans. An extremely low figure. Now, why is this? Interestingly, when the Soviet Union was breaking apart at the end of the 1980s, trust in Americans was far higher. There have been several things that have happened since the breakup of the USSR. One of them is the failure, if you want, of a quick transition towards something more positive in politics and economics, and the impoverishment of the Russian population. Many Russians, therefore, have associated Western-style democracy and market economies with their own particular economic conditions. They also, in many cases, like other parts of the world, are very disillusioned with mass culture from the U.S. To some extent, they're smitten by it. There's an MTV or its equivalent in Moscow. But they also despise grade B movies, pornography, what they see as the kind of debasement of culture that one finds in the West. But I think most importantly, and most relevant for us here, is their attitudes towards U.S. actions in foreign affairs, particularly beginning in the middle of the 1990s in the Balkans, when the United States and then NATO went into the Balkans, bombing Serbia. This was criticized by virtually everyone in Russia, from the street corner right up to the Kremlin. This was seen as an attack on a country that had had very close ties to Russia for well over a century. And so, the reasons for Russian discontent with the United States are not just culture or not just economic, but they have to do with U.S. foreign policy and the tendency, in their view, for the United States to act unilaterally. And, of course, when they see the United States acting through NATO, they see NATO as, in a sense, a kind of puppet. They would be wrong to view it that way, obviously. But I think many Russians still view him as a kind of puppet of the U.S. So Russia's championing of the U.N. must be seen in part in the context of its descent from power since the late 1980s. Let's look at what's happened to Russia in the last 15 years. It lost half of its population. It lost almost a third of its territory, which is now, Minister of Defense Sergei Ivanov tells us, going to require it to recruit soldiers from outside of Russian borders, almost as if they were going to have a new French Foreign Legion drawn from citizens of neighboring states that used to be in the former USSR. As I said, they've witnessed a collapse in their economy. The economy of Russia is now on a par with that of Brazil. Not bad by international standards. Brazil is a major player in world affairs. We wish they would produce far less concentrate. They are challenging Florida agricultural interest at this moment. And yet Brazil is seen as an emerging market. And Russia and Brazil are the two largest emerging markets in the world. Russia is no longer considered to be part of even the Second World, which, of course, they led until the collapse of communism. And the economic freefall has brought a dramatic reduction in military spending, which is combined with a fall in morale in the ranks to produce a Russian military that cannot be compared with what the Soviet Union was able to marshal only 20 years earlier. But I should say, and I'm a specialist in Russian politics, and so it's in my interest not to diss Russia too much, lest I sort of write myself out of a job and a future. Those people who are studying Russian here, like we have students doing at Stetson, not to fear. There are still a number of important things that will ensure that Russia will be a major player. First of all, it still has nuclear weapons. Its numbers are equal to those of the United States, even if the quality may be slightly less. It has a geography that is very much unlike Brazil. Brazil borders Paraguay, and Argentina, Uruguay, countries like this. Russia borders the United States, across the Bering Straits that we don't think of sometimes. It borders Japan and the northern islands of the Kurils. It borders China. It borders Korea. It borders Europe. And it has its borders very close to the southern rim countries that have been in the news over the last 2 years. It also maintains a web of economic, political, and military relationships with critical regional actors: Iran, Vietnam, Iraq, Syria. We just look in the newspaper over the last few days in Iraq, and we know that Russians had a contract for $8 billion with the Russian oil concerns. And they have a vested interest, therefore, in how the peace is made in Iraq. They also have a large former colonial space. Professor Cooper mentioned the French colonies in North Africa. Well, Russia had an empire that collapsed too in 1991, but it was a different kind of empire. It was a land empire. And 25 million ethnic Russians, when the USSR collapsed, found themselves outside of the boundaries of Russia. So this is also a very different picture than we see in a country like Brazil. And finally, maybe this is most important, Russia retains an ambition to play a major role in world affairs, given its history, given its geopolitical position, and I should say also given the educated population that it has. This is a very talented population. In this regard also, unlike Brazil, whose literacy rate cannot match that of Russia or the former socialist countries. So it's logical in a world, enough of this sort of background on Russia, let's turn back to the issue of the UN. It's logical in a world where one country moves towards hegemony, towards advancing unilateralism, for the other great powers to seek the means for this country's restraint, to prevent their own marginalization. And the UN is one such means. Though there are others, and there are all sorts of bilateral and multilateral engagements that the Russians have made with the Chinese, for example, in the Shanghai Accord, now the Shanghai Six, with China, Russia, and 4 Central Asian countries, which is there to fight terrorism and to serve also as a counterweight, as a counterbalance to the United States. So Russia champions the UN now because of its weakness. But to reach that conclusion, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't welcome Russian support for the UN, just that we should recognize that it too, like the United States, is acting in its own interest. Let me, in conclusion, talk about a couple of areas where Russia doesn't respect the UN, or at least Russia chafes at UN involvement in areas that is of interest to it. All countries do this. And the greater the country, the greater its military and economic power, the greater the likelihood is that it will see itself restrained inappropriately by multilateral organizations. Russia has been dismissive of the UN Human Rights Commissioner in her critical comments, the former Human Rights Commissioner, I should say, in her critical comments about human rights violations in Chechnya. And if any of you read the interview with Putin that was given to the New York Times on Saturday, when the journalist asked him from the Times about what was going on in Chechnya, effectively he said, it's none of your business. I mean, he didn't use words quite that undiplomatic, but it was a very terse answer, because he said, this is like me asking what's going on in Texas. For us, Chechnya is one of our 89 subject territories, is one of our 89 regions. And we don't want the United States or the UN or any organization criticizing us for that. There are other borderland crises also where the United Nations has sought to play a role. In Tajikistan, which is on the northern border of Afghanistan and used to be in the Soviet Union, is now essentially provided its military stability and its political stability by the Russian army. Also in the area of Georgia, there has been a horrible civil war in Georgia since the Soviet Union collapsed, with the Abkhaz people on the western part of Georgia, on the Black Sea coast, having broken away from the capital of Tbilisi. The Russians have played a not terribly dignified role, let's put it that way, in this civil war. They have sided with the Abkhaz. They have introduced Russian troops. They have acted unilaterally here against the wishes of the UN. And the UN now has a special representative to try to regulate the Georgian conflict, who constantly runs into problems with the Russians because the Russians want to resolve things on their own. Generally, within their former colonial boundaries, if we can put it that way, the areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union, Russia wants a pretty free hand. And we have to understand that Russians interpret the term peacekeeping somewhat differently. Mirotvorчество is the Russian word, and oftentimes international affairs specialists will translate it as peacemaking, because it's not simply going in once the situation has moved to a point where all of the parties want the UN involved. It is a more aggressive, more dynamic, more military kind of solution as opposed to a political instrument that Russia is willing to introduce, whether it's in Tajikistan, whether it's in Georgia, or whether or not it's in the former Russian Republic of Moldova, where the Russian army helped to bring about, I suppose, what you could call a settlement. But once again, they did it unilaterally. So what I'm suggesting here, then, is that it's true that Russia has been a great champion of the UN. Does that make them somehow morally superior to Americans because we have been critical? I would say, in a way, they occupy a different position. They are far weaker than we are. But I would caution us that we, too, one of these days, will not have the position that we have at the moment. There will be rising powers, whether those powers are individual states like China, or whether or not they are regional blocs like Europe, where the United States may regret undermining an institution which will be able to protect it as well as other nations in the future. Thanks very much.
1989 definitely marked the end of the World War II era. However, the UN organization was not adapted to these fundamental changes. I talked about that yesterday, but I don't know who of you was here then. We have, actually, in our eyes, the United Nations has gone out of balance. The Security Council does not represent the world as it is today. I'm not speaking of Germany as one of the P5 or P6 or P8 or whatever it's supposed to be. But I realize that Japan, for instance, is not valued in the Security Council, that India is not valued, that Brazil, as a large emerging power, is not. I see the difficulties, but I think we would expect America, as the leading power of the Western democracies, take a lead in this discussion of not come up with a final solution of this with the new Security Council setup. No, but lead the discussion. We are lacking the leadership of the United States in the United Nations to lead the United Nations as it was in the very beginning, when it was founded at the leadership and with the leadership of Americans. America, as the sole remaining superpower, so it seems, and seemed to many Europeans during the 90s, became less interested in multilateral approaches in crises. The Balkan Wars had shown how difficult and time-consuming it could be to cooperate with the Europeans who were and who are technologically far behind. For the United States, however, multilateralism is just one of several options, simply because it has the power to choose other paths. You can go it alone. The question is whether it's wise to go alone. Consensus building, cooperation with international regimes and organizations is conducted within a longer time frame, whereas unilateral action is quicker and sometimes more tempting. It may, however, be shorter-lived and hence more risky. When George W. Bush came into office, most Europeans were rather skeptic about him. I don't have to go into the details that. However, after September 11th, and the Europeans were with you on that day, we were part of it because we saw it. It had direct and unbelievable impact on the German people and on the European people. But, you know, until that time we looked at Bush rather skeptically. However, the very cautious way in which he went ahead to the United Nations passed a resolution on September the 12th condemning these acts, and another one on September 28th, making all those responsible who would harbor terrorists. You can read those resolutions, they're strong resolutions. But the cautious way in which the President put together an alliance against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban took most Europeans by surprise and earned the President new trust and respect. Most Europeans were very much on your side, and I can say that my country has been much on your side as far as the fight against terrorism is concerned. Sometimes this is forgotten that we had special German forces fighting side by side with your special forces against the Taliban in Afghanistan. We didn't do much talking about it, but we did it. And some people don't know that we probably right now have the largest contingent outside the U.S., the largest contingent of German soldiers in trying to stabilize Afghanistan. Hardly anyone knows, again, that we had naval operations of our naval at the Horn of, still have at the Horn of Africa, trying to keep the terrorists from crossing borders and crossing by the sea. No one hardly notices that the domestic policies of Germany have been very much in keeping with what Secretary Ashcroft is doing in this country, that we are trying to undercut the flows of money, that we are trying, the people whom we get, that we're trying to destroy the beds of the breeding beds of or the sleeping nests of Al-Qaeda terrorists, that we have sent one of them with the maximum sentence to jail, another one is up for sentencing very, very briefly. So I think we have done what we could do in the fight against terrorism, except one thing that we did not do. We did not join the war in Iraq. There was skepticism. We can talk about elections, we can do this, we can do that. We won't have the time to go into the details of this. I will just try to explain that the German public was very skeptic of the linkage between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. We know from experiences, from other long-time diplomatic experiences, that Saddam was one of the best hated persons in the Islamic world. And so we would not believe this. We thought it would have been wiser to continue the inspections, and as it turns out, I say so without any kind of schadenfreude, as it turns out, we were right about the not so imminent threat of weapons of mass destructions. I think the publics in Europe, all of them, in England, in Spain, in Italy, even in Warsaw, you had demonstrators out on the streets in large numbers protesting against the war. And in Berlin, of course. Where's the difference? We had an election going on. And if you ask any candidate to disregard public sentiment during an election time, he will just look at you and say, look, you're out of your senses. So there was the difference. I think that we differ essentially on the idea of preemptive strikes. That is the most serious issue between us. Because we do not believe that one country has the right to decide when or whom it is going to attack. This is exactly the history that we have come from and that we have wanted to overcome for the last 55 years. And that is why we feel so strongly about this. It makes us ask the questions, well, who will be next? Not on the side of the Americans, but who will be next to declare, I am imminently threatened and I'm going to throw a bomb at somebody else? Particularly with the spread, with the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And the serious question that must be that must be addressed is the fact, if Saddam Hussein got knocked out, why doesn't the North Koreans get knocked out? Well, we know it, because they have nuclear arsenals. So wouldn't it be wise for all these other little bad guys to acquire nuclear weapons so they wouldn't get attacked? It causes so many risks, this idea of preemptive strikes, that we would prefer the United States to take the lead in setting up a new system to deal with Chapter 51 of the United States Charter. And it's sort of an early warning system, but that we would implement together, that not one country could decide alone what to do and when to do it. I'm not saying we should never use force, but I'm saying if we have to use force against another country or another group of enemies, it will not necessarily be countries, because these sort of bandits who come together to terrify the world. So if we have to do it, we have to have some larger body of deciding in which way and when and how we're going to do it. It cannot be left up to one country alone, because that would give an example to others. There are enormous conflicts between, let's say, Pakistan and India. Both of them have nuclear weapons. So what happens if one of them goes crazy? Will we allow that? Will we not allow that? Will that be sanctioned then by the sort of theory of preemptive strikes? And I can think of a few other critical areas. So we would like to see the Americans take a leadership in developing, yes, a stronger, perhaps more active role of preservation of peace and fighting, using power against rebel rousers in the world, but not let one country go it alone. Thank you.